on first, okay? Because I got a bunch of stuff open.
Okay.
So let's see. So give me a second and I'll get it open in a flash, I promise.
All right. We're going to start the seminar in just a couple minutes. I had already clicked it, so we've got people
Okay.
joining.
All right.
But it'll take a few minutes for everybody to get in.
All right.
We're at 37 participants.
Oh, you know what? I can't do that, Danny, because I made some changes to yours. I made some changes in the animation and I did it on yours.
Do you want to go see if you can get him up?
Yeah.
Before we start?
Yeah.
We're going to just let everybody get into the seminar, into the webinar, and we're going to get the Dan's screen up with his PowerPoint, and then we'll start the program. So hang tight, everyone.
You're already in the meeting, right?
Share.
There we go. You just have to make it full screen. There we go. All right. And we're going to go ahead and get started, everyone. I know that there'll be probably a few more people joining us, but I want to welcome you all today to our electronic voting webinar. And it's going to be presented by Dan and Eileen McCrady. They're with HOAst Incorporated. And they're going to give you a lot of great information on using electronic voting. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Eileen and Dan.
That sounds great. Thanks very much, Karen. I don't see my video up, but that's fine. Nobody needs to see my face. So I just want to welcome everyone and say that this should be a pretty good time that we all spent together today. Dan is going to do most of the presentation this morning or this afternoon. So please enjoy, and we'll talk to you as we go through this. Let me introduce Dan. So I'll go to the next slide, and I'll introduce Dan for you because, you know, he's not advancing the slide, but there you go. Okay, so Dan is going to do most of the presentation today. As you can see here, he's a retired IT guy, and his emphasis has been on database design, which of course is a really good fit for this particular operation and platform. Dan was a recipient of the Presidential Award for Management Improvement, as a matter of fact, when he worked at the Internal Revenue Service. And Dan, along with Eileen, is the co-founder and the CTO of HOAst Incorporated. We've been married for 43 years, and we still like each other, even as we've been working at our home offices the last few weeks. We have 2 children, we've got a bunch of grandkids, and they insist on making us, their ancestors, lifelong learners, which is a good thing. Dan's degree is in information technology. And just as a sideline, I'd like to add that Eileen, myself, I was also working in the Internal Revenue Service. And one of the things that I found most enjoyable was when I actually was the chief for systems implementation and deployment of the electronic filing system. That is, those people who file their tax returns electronically. So this kind of a business was a really good fit for me as well. And so that's who we are. And we'll go on from now, and Dan will start and tell you what we hope to cover today.
Eileen, do you want to mention about questions?
Oh, sure. Okay. So also, as we go through this today, we would ask you to use the chat feature. I'm going to send out a note right now, and it's going to be to, well, I guess maybe not. Okay. So if you're going to use, if you have a question today, what we'd like you to do is use the chat feature. You'll see that probably at the bottom of your screen. You see a bunch of icons, one of which looks like a little bubble, little note bubble, and it says chat under it. If you click on it, you will have an opportunity to send your questions. What I would ask you to do is please direct your questions to I guess all, I don't see one for Eileen McCrady. So I guess, Karen, if you can set that up to have them just send their questions to Eileen, because that way I'll be monitoring the chat. And after a while, when Danny finishes a certain segment, then he will, he'll stop, he'll pause, and he'll ask if there are any questions. And if we're not able to set them up through this, if Eileen McCrady doesn't show up on your screen, I'll just run over into the side office and read the questions from Danny's chat screen. So don't worry about it. If you don't see Eileen McCrady on that, as someone to whom you could send your questions, then just use Dan McCrady as panelist. Okay, so that's how we're going to handle questions. Any question you have about this presentation, type it in the chat. Please send it only to Dan McCrady. Here's what we have found out as we've done these. If you send it to everyone, first of all, everyone gets distracted. And then some people try to reply to everyone, and you kind of lose the flow of the presentation. So we'd ask you to conform to that if you would. Okay.
This is Karen. When you pull up the little box to do the chat,
Yeah.
it's at the bottom, there's a to, and
Yeah.
if you click on the little arrow, they can direct their message privately to you or to Dan.
Oh, okay. I didn't see me in the list. That's great. Oh, that's because it's me.
That's because it's
Great,
you.
okay.
Yeah.
Thanks, right. Okay, so
They
Eileen
should-
McCrady does show up, so that's great. Please forward those questions to me. Thank you, Karen. That's great. All right, so with that, let's begin then. So Dan, if you would.
Okay, hi there, everybody, and good afternoon. Hope everybody's staying safe. I think this is going to be a very interesting seminar on electronic voting. I hope you enjoy it and you find it educational. So we will begin. First of all, let's talk about what we're going to talk about today. We're going to cover just some of the statutes regarding electronic voting and the DBPR administrative rules. We're going to talk about how technology is really affecting us on a daily basis, and it's really replacing or changing our paper-based concepts. And we're going to talk about the benefits of electronic voting and how to get started. So let's start with the Florida statutes and the DBPR administrative rules. Now, electronic voting began with the statutes being changed in July of 2015. Not much happened then, but here's what the statutes said at that time. First of all, the statutes regarding electronic voting are the same for all of the for homeowners, condos, and cooperatives. So I can cover this in one quick sweep because they are all the same. Now, the statute says that you have to be able to authenticate the member's identity. That means that you can't just know that an electronic vote was received from 123 Oak Street. You have to know who the voter was. You must identify the member. And the statutes at this time just said you had to be able to transmit a receipt that you had voted electronically, and that's really all it said. Also said that a member shall be counted in attendance. This was a benefit that Florida gave all of our associations, is that just the fact that I voted electronically means the quorum has been added to. I don't have to be present. I don't have to send in a proxy. Just my electronic vote all by itself means that it's just as if I was there. That was a huge benefit that Florida gave us. And they do require a board resolution. And the board resolution is only voted on by the board members, but there are actually four parts to it. It must establish the reasonable procedures, the procedures for opting in to say, I want to be an online voter, procedures for opting out, I've changed my mind, I no longer want to be one, and the deadline to consent, that is the deadline to opt in and the deadline to opt out. That's the only part of the board resolution that is required. Now, the deadlines are usually relative deadlines, relative dates, like the deadline to opt in might be 1 day before the meeting, or it might be 15 days before the meeting. The point is, if it's relative to the meeting, 1 day before the meeting, then your board resolution will be in effect for all future meetings. Now, that was what Florida came up with. And then the DBPR, almost 7 months later, came up with their own little tweaks on this system. First of all, although the Florida state said you had to have a receipt, DBPR came in and was a lot more specific. It must be an email. It must have all of this information, including, if you look at the last piece, it must have the user identification. In other words, the email, again, it doesn't say that thanks for getting the vote received from 123 Oak Street. The email says, and this is who you are. This is the legal member, the valid member for voting. So again, we're back to that user identification. And DBPR also made it very clear that you must keep an official record of your electronic votes. This was probably assumed all along, but this was very specific, stated by DBPR. And the very bottom says that the date and time of the receipt of electronic voting must be kept on each ballot. So that means that each ballot is going to be stamped with the date and time. The ballot is still anonymous. You still have no voter name. You still have no voter address, but there is a date of receipt on that. Eileen, any questions?
No, there are no questions at this time.
Okay. So let's talk about the other changes.
Excuse me, I'm sorry, yes there is. It's not really for me though. So this is a question for Sandy, I think. Sandy, the question is, will we receive the PowerPoint in a PDF so we don't have to take extensive notes? So I don't know how you...
That question is, we are recording the seminar and we will post it up on our website.
Thank you.
All right.
Okay, and I have a couple of other questions. One question is, how long must those records be kept? That's the next question.
The records to keep an electronic voting information is the same as to keep paper information. Remember that electronic voting is not changing the statutes. If you're currently keeping your paper for 3 months or for a year, you're going to keep the electronic information the same length of time, except that since the electronic information is in electronic form, there is a possibility of keeping that for many years if that's of any value to you. But it's there until you get rid of it.
Thank you. And the next question is, and I can take this one for you, Danny. What is the DBPR? That's the Department of Business and Professional Regulation. And for the most part, that's the body in Florida that puts out the administrative rules that, that talk about condominium associations for the most part.
Yes, the DBPR provides all the rules for condos very specifically. However, it is a strong suggestion that the HOAs follow their voting procedures. But admittedly, the HOA has can bypass some of the procedures where condos cannot.
Right. Next question is, and this is where I usually do my caveat. Dan says that I'm that little banner that scrolls along the bottom of the screen that says we are not attorneys. We've never played them on TV, although I really do have a hankering to do that. I'd love to play one on TV. The question is, does the member's ID have to be the legal name on the condo deed? And remember, we're not giving a legal opinion when we say this.
Now, I can tell you this, that in all voting software, the voting software is getting the voter information from you, the association. Whether it's with our software or one of our competitor software, you are determining who the voter is, and then the software honors that determination. So that's a question back to you. And again, that might be a legal question as well. I do know that that Florida does not approve voting by not business entities. Like Sun Trust is not supposed to vote. Sun Trust is supposed to provide a voting certificate naming a human being that votes to represent them. But again, the voting information comes from you.
Okay, the next question is, What if the association does not use a secret ballot?
In the case of condos, you have no choice. If you're in Florida, you must use a secret ballot. If you're in another state or you're an HOA and you're doing an amendment change, that's fine. The good software should be able to be asked you that question. Do you want it to be secret or not secret? And the software is going to honor that. Therefore, if it is secret, it is going to remove the voter name and the voter address from the vote itself. If it's not secret, then it's going to assume that you have to keep the vote name and the vote address hooked to the ballot itself.
Okay, last question for right now is, do both the association and the voter receive confirmation of the vote?
No, keep in mind that that could have been an election where it's a secret or anonymous vote. It would be improper to send that email to anybody except the actual voter. If that email was going to the association, then it would not really be an anonymous or secret vote.
Yeah, and I would just point out that, I'm sorry, go ahead, Dan.
I was going to say, because the email receipt has the actual vote cast as well, and that was dictated by the DBPR.
Right, and I would make the distinction between a confirmation of the specific ballot that an individual cast, with keeping track of how many votes have been cast and for whom. There's of course a distinction there. Okay, I actually do have another question. And again, before I read this question, remember, electronic voting, we'll get into this very soon, doesn't change the rules, right? It doesn't change the rules for voting in an association. So here's the question. I am assuming a voting certificate would have to be obtained from one person in a household before they could be set up to electronically vote. Is that correct?
And that depends on your depends on your community documents. Some communities allow any owner to vote. So if you have two owners, then either one of them can vote. You can't have two votes from that address, but either owner could have submitted the vote. Some associations have community documents that say where you must specify which of the two owners will be the voter. Depends upon the community documents.
Okay, here's a follow-up.
Yeah.
Yeah, I just have a follow-on to the previous question, and then we do have to move on. So this is a follow-on to, does the association and the voter receive confirmation of the vote? And as I mentioned, there's a distinction between confirmation of how the voter voted and keeping track of the number of votes. The question is, then how does the association know how many have voted?
Okay, well, in our software, which is the only thing I can really relate to, is we will keep a running total of your quorum. So you'll know how your quorum is building throughout. You're not allowed to know what the results of the voting is, but you are allowed to know how the quorum is running. Other competitors, I don't know how they do it. Well,
now, what you just mentioned, though, Danny, has to do with a secret ballot. If it's not a secret ballot, then they can see how many votes are coming in and what the tally is. Yeah.
If it's not a secret ballot, you are allowed to open up the envelope as it's mailed or delivered to you. You're allowed to see the vote, and you're allowed to enter and begin tallying the votes immediately. It's only the secret votes that have the restriction to wait until the annual meeting and then to open them up and handle them as anonymous ballots.
Yeah, so the quick answer is the system will keep track of the votes, and you'll be able to know how many people have voted. Okay,
yes.
Thanks. So great
I'll
question.
I'll cover that in more detail in a few minutes.
All righty. Thanks, Danny.
Okay, so more of changing from paper to digital. And this one thing that Eileen just said, that the statutes have not changed regarding voting. So electronic voting is not changing any of the statutes. It's just another way for the vote to come in. So questions like, when is the first notice sent, or how do I validate the voter list, or what can invalidate the ballot? This is like a paper ballot. All these questions are not affected by electronic voting. Electronic voting is just another way to get the vote in, get it in simpler, and get it in more securely. Now we know that the technology is changing our whole lives and our shopping, banking. You know that you log into your bank and you do banking information, and most of us send our returns electronically to IRS. So electronic voting is just another aspect of this, and electronic voting is not new. Electronic voting might have been going on for 20 years. It hasn't been going on for 20 years for Florida, but Florida was the, I believe, the 24th state to come in and start using electronic voting. So Florida benefits from a lot of electronic voting in other states. Now, the statute says that the members must consent in writing to online voting, and there's your references for for this statute. Must consent in writing. But we're going to talk about electronic signatures, and that is interesting when you say must consent in writing. So Florida approved the use of electronic signatures in 2011, and there's again another reference since we're not attorneys. And Florida defined an electronic signature as what you see here. It could be an indicator, a sound, symbol, process. And electronic signatures, to make it very clear to you and to your own common use, when you get into a software package and you see the terms and conditions, which have to be signed before you can go any further, there's usually a little box at the very bottom of the terms and conditions that you check. Just take your mouse and check. That is your electronic signature. So we've been using electronic signature sometimes without really knowing it, but that is electronic signature because that check in that box is your intent to sign. So now that we know what electronic signature is, let's see what that the Uniform Electronic Transaction Act, that reference, that 668 reference says. Now again, I don't want to have to read this to you, but it's saying that the electronic signature is not going to be denied because it's electronic. It says that if a law says this is not legal unless it has a signature, the electronic signature satisfies that. And more specifically with what we're talking about with the board resolution, if it has the same effect as written signatures. So when it says you must have a written signature, an electronic one meets that provision. And again, this has been true since 2011 in Florida. And this is true, by the way, in every state. So let's talk about the benefits of electronic voting. So why would we want to do this? Right now, we have those of you who have not moved into electronic voting, you have votes coming in, they're in paper. You generally will check off the address on some address list just to make sure you don't get two from the same address. They sit in a box somewhere. They're meant to be secure, and eventually at the meeting in front of the members, they'll be counted and you get the results. Well, now when you think about electronic ballots, obviously there's no paper involved. An electronic ballot can be accessed by anything that can reach the internet, including your smartphone, including your iPad. If you can get to the internet, you can get to your electronic ballot. Now that means that since the internet is available 24/7, so is the vote available 24/7. And since the internet is available everywhere around the world, and even on like cruise ships, that means that your electronic ballot is available anywhere you are. Now that means that rather than having the problem of sending you a ballot and maybe it goes to the wrong address, or maybe you're on a cruise ship, we can just send an email to you saying it's time to vote, and wherever you are, you get to your email, and wherever you are, you get to the internet. So wherever you are, you're getting to the vote and you can vote. It simplifies a lot of process. So e-ballots can't be lost, drop behind the couch, sent to the wrong address, eaten by the dog. E-ballots are going to be available to you wherever you are. And again, as I said before, each electronic ballot adds to your election quorum. So if we were doing electronic balloting only, which we cannot in Florida, we have to allow for paper. You know, submitting your ballot electronically is an option. It is not a requirement. If it was a requirement, it would look like this. So this is the real picture of what's going on right now in Florida, and it's going on in many, many places. It's getting very popular that we still have people, this is before the virus, of course, we still have people coming to the meeting carrying a paper ballot, and we still have people mailing their ballot in. So we still have somebody receiving these or keeping these paper ballots, the paper envelopes, in a box and keeping them somewhat secure. Meanwhile, the electronic ones are coming in and are being kept in a secure server. So in the middle of that page there, where you see the little sheet with the pencil, that's keeping track of the addresses that are submitting electronic votes. Therefore, when you're on number 2, the lower line there, you're at the meeting, and now you open up the ballot box and start looking at these envelopes, you are matching them to the list of addresses provided by the computer. Because if an address received an electronic vote, then that address will already be checked off and the paper envelope you have cannot be accepted. So that's how you merge the concept of electronic votes coming all along, and then at the meeting, you're now handling paper. That is the way you make sure that the paper vote you're looking at is not, in fact, a duplicate. And then in the prior screen, the little man there in the bottom where it says enter, it said count before because that gentleman would just count all of the paper. Now that gentleman can actually enter the selections into the computer, and now the computer has the paper entries, the electronic entries, one system of record, and one count, doing the count for you. Any questions, Eileen?
Yes, we have 2 questions. One has to do with the second notice, the 60-day second notice. I'm going to ask that question when you get to the how do we get started section. So bear with us. I know you have a question out here about a 60 days prior to the annual meeting and how will it get affected. I think that'll become clearer when Dan talks about the process of how to get started. So we're going to just defer that for a minute. Here's another one. Remember, we're not attorneys, but I think the answer to this one's going to be fairly straightforward, Dan. Can the survey tool, SurveyMonkey, be used as a legal method for electronic voting for condominiums in Florida, according to regulations by the DVPR?
Unless SurveyMonkey has changed drastically, no, it cannot. There's a lot of restrictions. The statute is very clear about a lot of security aspects of your voting system, and it's not easy to meet all of them. As an example, an electronic voting package from any other state would not be legal to use in Florida unless that electronic voting software was tweaked a lot to meet the Florida statutes. Florida is unique in what it requires for a electronic voting software to be legal. Okay.
That's the last question for this segment, Danny. Thank you.
All right. Okay, so WIIFM, for those of you who don't know what that means, that is not a radio station. It means what's in it for me. Okay, we're going to save time and money. And why do you save time? Because if you go to a meeting and you have, say, 100 ballots, but 80 of them were sent in electronically, then you only have 20 to actually have to count. It's going to save a lot of time at the annual meeting. Saving money, this might be an answer to one of the other questions. You do not have to mail the ballot, the candidate information sheets, the general proxy, the notice. You do not have to mail that to a member who has opted in to do e-voting. So that can be a great savings in time and money, not having to do that mailing. That means that if 40% of your community has signed the opt-in form, you only need to mail the ballot and information to 60% of your community. For you condo folks on an election, that means that the entire second notice does not get mailed out to the 40% who have opted in for e-voting. When you do another vote and all you have is the one mailing, that mailing does not have to go at all to the people who have opted in for e-voting. great savings on time, great savings on money. And we improved the accuracy. I know in our system, there's no such thing as an invalid vote. If you can only mark one selection and you mark two, the system stops you and says, nope, you can only mark one. It takes care of all the validity. If you've already voted, it's not going to let you vote a second time. It's going to make sure that vote is valid. And you eliminate the need to handle papers for signatures. Since we allow electronic signatures, there's no reason why we can't do electronic signatures for the opt-in forms or the opt-out forms. You can eliminate a lot of handling of paper and make it easier to reach quorum. Imagine this, because this is a real life scenario. Let's say you've got 40% of your community opted in for electronic voting, and you're running an election and you need, let's say you need 20% as your quorum. Okay, so the other 60%, the 60% that are not opted in, you go to the mailbox and you're mailing in the postal mail their material. That's the moment that you open up the electronic voting. You have the electronic vote created, and you send an email to the 40% who have opted in, because you're not sending them postal mail, or you don't have to anyway. So you send an email to those 40%. Typically, if a person is going to vote at all, they're going to vote when they receive the email, because it doesn't take more than 30 seconds to vote. So if they vote as typical, then you're going to meet your 20% in the first 24 hours. You're going to meet your 20% before the postal mail has even been delivered. Meeting quorum is just a piece of cake for those that use electronic voting and reach high levels of opting in rates. And it certainly simplifies the voting process, because we have a very tough voting process in Florida with the outer envelopes and the inner envelopes and verifying the votes and keeping them safe and secure and keeping them anonymous. That whole process happens very, very fast and very easily if you're voting electronically. And you're increasing transparency. I mean, this is going to be so nice that you vote electronically. You get an email receipt saying it was received, saying what you voted for. And remember, no human being has touched that ballot. Increased member participation, that's easy. First of all, it's so easy to vote. If it takes only 30 seconds, and you don't have to read all the material that comes in the package for voting. That's going to increase member participation. But also, there are many people who are overseas or in Mexico, in Canada, and these people, in many cases, they cannot get the ballot filled out and mail it back in enough time. But when you're voting online, you're voting based upon receiving an email. And that whole process, receiving the email and voting, that can be done in 5 minutes or less. So the problem about not having time to get the vote in goes away. And the other problem is, as I said, sending the ballot to the wrong address, that goes away. How many votes do we have that we consider invalid? That goes away. You certainly will find that you get more member participation and easier time reaching quorum. So again, obviously, we're reducing paper. Increasing security. I asked the DVPR, and they cover election challenges, and I asked them, do you expect more or less election challenges due to electronic voting? And they said less. When I asked why, the person I was talking to at the DVPR said that every election challenge is based on one of two things. A human being did something that they weren't allowed to do, or a human being did not do something that they were supposed to do. Well, with electronic voting, the human being has been taken out of the equation. The vote goes right from your place, right from your computer, right from your home, directly into the count. So there is no human being that is going to do something that is not going to be allowed. Eileen, any questions?
Yes, we have a few questions. So let's see, I have a couple of different places I have to go to. Let's see, I'll open this one first. Okay, if people are on electronic voting, how do they get the second notice?
The second notice is replaced with the email saying it's time to vote. When they go into the system and they see the electronic votes, you can attach all the documentation that was mailed to the electronic vote. So instead of having to mail them the 2 envelopes and the candidate information sheets, you just take the candidate information sheets and attach them to the electronic vote. Now the electronic voter can view that information, print the information, search it, whatever they want. But their second notice is replaced entirely by the online votes.
And that is if they have opted in for electronic voting.
Yes.
Okay. Okay, let's see. The next question is, I'm holding that 60-day one still. If a second vote, this is interesting, and a lot of it depends on whether it's a secret election or not. If a second vote comes at the meeting, that should cancel both because someone else in the household may have voted.
That is an excellent point. And that is, I don't know who's asking that question, but that's a very wise person. Yes, the statute says that if you have 2 votes, and this is the case of election, 2 votes for the same election, that you cancel both of them. You're absolutely right. The statute also says a received ballot may not be rescinded. So there you have 2 conflicting rules. The first one says you should not regard either one of them, and the second one says you can't not regard the one that came in first. So in DBPR's opinion, you keep the electronic one because it came in, it was received, so it cannot be rescinded, and the person has an email receipt saying it has been received. So to not accept that one would be to be violating one of the rules. But as you said, you have 2 rules that are in competition. So I can only tell you what the opinion of the DBPR was when I spoke to them.
Right. So you would check with your attorney because we have attorneys who have different, as you might imagine, who have different opinions on that. But the fact of the matter is it is received. The individual has received confirmation, and a received ballot cannot be rescinded. So you know. Now, if it's
even more than that, the vote that comes in electronically, the name must be removed, the address must be removed, and the statute says the program cannot have the ability to put it back together. Therefore, if you wanted to get rid of that one, it would be impossible because you can't locate it.
Now, if it's not a secret election, that's another whole set of things. You can certainly delete the first one and do another vote.
Yes.
Okay. So there's another question. Let's see. Oh, this is interesting too. So what organization certifies that a particular e-voting system meets the regulations? Is there an independent organization that does that testing of the system to verify that?
There is not. If you talk to somebody who says, I've got electronic voting software that is certified in Florida, run screaming. There is no certification process. I talked to DBPR requesting that there be one. The DBPR says they do not expect it to ever happen. They do not want to be in the role of certifying software. So what they do is they provide the statutes. They try to make the statutes clear enough that you understand them, and they expect you to ask the proper questions. I can say that a lot of people will ask a very blunt question up front. Do you meet the Florida statutes and the DBPR administrative rules? And if they say yes, then they'll also say, can you please provide that in writing? There has to be some trust here, but if you have that in writing, you have some protection. Some associations will talk to somebody who has been using electronic voting or talk to their attorney. But just keep in mind that not all attorneys are technologically savvy and have the experience. Some do, some don't. But no, the quick answer to your question is there is no certification process, and there is likely to be none in the future.
Thank you, Danny. Okay, the next question will take a little bit to answer, and I'm going to defer this to the end. I'll ask it now, and if we have time at the end, we'll answer it. If not, we'll be happy to take it offline to talk with you about it. It says, how large of a community is needed to make this cost effective? We have 294 units. I mean, you know,
that's a matter of opinion. I know we have, our smallest is 17, our largest is 9,000, so there's a huge range. We've had one as small as 6. Typically, if you ask for a rule of thumb, I would think it'd be somewhere around 50. I mean, if you have a couple hundred, you're way over the minimum. And again, it's not all just a matter of math. You're getting huge benefits out of electronic voting beyond just the cost.
Yeah, for example, meeting quorum way ahead of time is a huge one for most people, for a lot of people. Okay, here's the last question for this segment, and then we are going to move on because we're slowly creeping up on the end of this session. Okay, so is opting in to online voting different from owners opting in to receive official condo communications and documents online? We've done the latter process with our owners. Do we need a similar consent process for opting into electronic voting? And Danny, I know we could go a long time on opting in, but make it a quick reply, please.
Yes, it is different. Opting in for receiving official communication via email is one process. It's entirely another process to opt in to receive, to be an online voter. Keep in mind that opting in for e-voting can be handled by the software, or it can be a different form and handled by you. Those are the choice you need to make, whether you want to handle that or have the software handle it. Okay, so let's continue on. How to get started? First of all, we suggest step 1 is to choose your software provider first. And you might have wondered why we didn't say do the board resolution first, because without the board resolution, you can't do electronic voting. The reason is that your board resolution will change depending upon your software provider. For example, if your software provider can take care of all of your opting in and opting out so that you have no form, no filing, nothing to mail out, your board resolution must say that. If your software provider cannot do that work for you, then your board resolution needs to say there's a piece of paper that you have to use. So get your software provider first, and then have your software provider help you out with the board resolution. It really is a mistake to do the board resolution first.
I'm going to interrupt for a second there, Dan. Remember that we want to address that, the 60-day notification somewhere in this getting started period.
Okay. Number 2 is, number 3, you then provide your community with a 14-day notice for a meeting where the board's going to vote on the resolution. So you write a resolution, and then at a board meeting, the board is going to vote on the resolution that the board wrote. I've never seen it not pass, but you are obligated to give your membership a 14 days notice minimum that the board does intend to make this vote on the board resolution. And I would take that seriously enough that I would have an affidavit, same as you do for your annual meeting. And then you begin working with your provider to build your voting site. Now, you should be able to build your voting site during that 14 days. You've got a 14 days where things must wait. No one can opt in prior to that 14 days because a resolution has not passed yet. So that's a good 14-day period to get the whole site up and running. And then if you have a software provider that is giving you unlimited use, if you do, then create a survey as a practice vote and allow your members to see what it looks like to vote. And I say that because it's hard to believe that you could actually vote in 30 seconds, faster than you can find a stamp. When someone experiences that, you're likely to have them as an online voter, and you're going to benefit from that for the rest of the time. So a survey, if you're not going to pay per vote, a survey is a great way to introduce them to online voting and to get them set up with a username and a password and to know where the site is in the cloud. And then the last step is you invite your members to participate in that survey. You watch the quorum build, and then thereafter you have a nice, easy process of getting votes in and getting to quorum. Eileen, any other questions?
Yes, I have a couple of questions. So if the software does handling the opting in, does the association, oops, it just scooted up on me. Does the association get updated regularly on who has opted in? I would just say that there are a number of different softwares, not all of which do the opting in online. So make it a quick reply about a software that you're familiar with that might track.
Okay.
This.
If the software is doing the opting in for you, then the opting in process and the opting in forms process list is part of your records. You own the records. You own the data in the software. So positively, it should be available to you at your fingertips constantly.
Next question. If there is no certification, how does my board do the necessary testing to feel comfortable purchasing the software?
There's a couple things you can do. One is you can create an electronic voting task force, and they read the statutes and they ask the right questions, and they try to find only those software companies that claim that they are compliant. Or you can, if you know an attorney that has some knowledge of electronic voting, you can rely on them. In our case, we teach these classes because we want people to know that we know the state statutes and we know the DBPR rules. So when we provide electronic voting, we know the material. But again, you have to ask the question, the first question out of your mouth is, are you compliant with the statutes and DBPR administrative rules? I would believe that most software companies are not going to lie to you about that.
No, they'll tell the truth. The other thing, and Danny's going to go over some of the questions that you should ask that will help, some of which will help you decide if they are in fact compliant. The other thing is work with your provider. Ask them to give you training until you feel confident using it. Okay, moving on. Can software count half votes? We've had husband and wife casting 2 different votes counted as a half. That's the comment.
I would believe so. I would believe that the software can be programmed any way at all. I'm not sure I've seen that. I have seen where the wife gets a half and the husband gets a half, but they both have to vote. If you're talking about if only one of them votes, it's a 1, and if they each vote, it's half each. I'm not sure I've seen that in software.
Okay.
I have seen where an address will get a portion of a vote based upon square footage, which means their vote weight goes to 4 digits to the right of the decimal point. So it can get very, very detailed.
Okay, let's see. So here's another comment. As an IT guy myself, I can't feel comfortable purchasing software without a real test process. Yeah, so you would ask your provider, can you give me a sandbox to play in? And hopefully they give you a sandbox to play in.
Absolutely.
I understand that. Yeah, you need to feel comfortable about it, certainly.
Absolutely.
The last question for right now is, are we permitted to recommend software? Can we provide a typical price range? And I'm going to ask Karen if we're allowed, or Karen, if we're allowed to recommend software. I would guess during this presentation, not so much. If you wish to contact us afterwards, we'd be happy to, because we are software providers. Okay, so I'm not sure it would make sense for us to go there. And a typical price range, it is all over the board, depending on what you want, what your provider provides, what you need for your, there's a lot of solutions out there, or not a lot, but there are several solutions out there, and you need to find the one that suits you best. What is it you want? And can that provider get it for you? So there are a lot of questions, and Danny will give you some of them, and we're happy to handle any other questions you have another time, or if Karen has another suggestion, that's fine as well.
Well, on this screen here, we're starting off with saying we're looking for a customer-centric company. That's just a basic thing saying that they have to think that you as a customer that you're important. Also, we believe that you're either working with a Florida company or a company that is vested in Florida, because Florida statutes are going to change. And you want to make sure you're working with a company that's vested in Florida, so they're going to change along with the statutes. And you want to ask the question about, you have this member opting in, which is required in Florida. It's the only state that requires this process. But how does it happen? If it happens with a piece of paper, you're doing all the work, you're doing all the filing, and there is no expiration of this form. If the software is doing it, then you have no work to do. But not all software will do it. Are the opt-in deadline dates handled in such a way as to prevent late opt-in, late and opt-out? Well, if the software is doing it, I can guarantee you it's handled in that way. If you're doing it, it becomes a little bit more complicated. Like, are you talking about the date you received it, the date it was signed, or the date it was opened? It gets a little bit more questionable if a human being has to make these decisions. Are e-ballot results combined with paper ballot results? In that picture I showed you the person who was entering the ballots, the paper ballots, were entering the choices into the system. So in that case, they were combined. There is no statute that says they have to be combined, but they can be. There's no reason why they couldn't be. If they're combined, then when you save the record for the next 10, 15, 20 years, you're saving the record of both. And how can you determine the election, the quorum? My picture here is right here. Determine election quorum. Yeah, election quorum is very easy to determine and very easy to compute if you're using software. So I would hope that the software would just keep you apprised of what the quorum is. How do you prevent duplicate electronic ballots? The software is going to take care of that. If the electronic ballot comes in, then when the person logs on again, the software is not going to allow another vote from that address. And if you see a demo, you should see that very clearly being done that way. I like to log on as one owner and vote, and then show a demo of logging on as the other voter, and the other voter should not be able to vote because they're coming from the same address. How do you keep election results from being accessible to the association prior to the scheduled election? Yeah, that is a very good question, and you might get different answers. I know there's always a way to get around the system, but if you have a good audit trail, there's no way of keeping it a secret. So what I like to do is to make sure there's an audit trail that is uneditable, that cannot be deleted, and if I do everything right and you do an election challenge, it's going to show you that your election challenge is not valid. And if I do everything wrong, I'm going to be in trouble. Eileen, questions?
Yep, so here's one. So we purchase the software, then we own both the software program and voting data. And what I would say to that is, I don't know of any software that is not proprietary, which means you wouldn't own the software. For example, in our case, it's a subscription to the software, but the data belongs exclusively to the community. The data just, we wouldn't touch it. The data belongs, we help you, but the data belongs to the community. Do you want to add something, Danny?
Yes, it reminds me of one other question about costs. Keep in mind there's two aspects to costs. Certainly you want to know what it's going to cost to vote, but the other question is, are you getting unlimited votes for that cost, or are you paying per election? If you're paying per election, don't be surprised if your election has to be postponed that you'll be paying again. So that's a good question when you're comparing. Make sure you're comparing apples to apples.
Okay, let's see. I have to print out an affidavit saying who I mailed the ballots to. How does that affect that in regard to the 60-day mailing?
That doesn't sound like an electronic voting question. Your
So if
60-day notice, that would be your first notice. And electronic voting does not change your first notice, except that your first notice has to say that electronic voting is an option. Other than that, electronic voting does not change the rules regarding the first notice.
Okay, and here's another question. What is the usual security process to validate the ballot was entered by a member? Well, first of all, before the security falls into place, we have an authentication process at the front end of that, right? And just as most online subscriptions you have to your bank or to any other place that needs a good level of security, my guess is you have a username and a password that is unique to you, for which you are responsible. So that would be the way you would authenticate. And then every system has different security measures, and that would be an important question to ask your provider.
But if you have two owners for a property and either one of them can vote, just make sure that each owner has their own unique credentials, because in order to be compliant, the software has to know which owner voted, even though either one could have, and even though they are voting for the same address, the statutes require that the statute knows which one did the voting.
Right. Okay, I've got two more questions. Our voting says only one person in a married couple needs to sign the paper ballot, but if not married, both people need to. Can software systems handle that?
The software systems that I'm familiar with, they do not, because you have to know who the voter is, and the statute is written as if it's only one member. Only one person can actually log on. Only one person can submit the online vote.
Okay, another one just came in, so I'm going to quickly go through these. Is opting in needed for every vote, or can a single opt-in apply in perpetuity or until they specifically opt out?
When you opt in, you're opted in forever unless you decide to opt out. You can opt in and opt out as often as you want, which again makes it troublesome if you're using paper. But you can opt in and opt out whenever. You're opted in until you opt out.
Okay, if the association changes management companies and the next management company does not use your system, will the association still have access to prior voting records? Absolutely.
Yeah, absolutely, and that's another good question. You own the data. You always own the data, and if you're using a software and you may walk some point, you should be able to take that data with you. You own the data always.
I want to do a little follow-up on this opting in, Dan. For software that has a single use, I'm not sure how they would retain opting in records unless they were on paper, which is another whole kettle of fish. If you could quickly.
Yeah, yes. Well, single use, it's possible because you could keep the records and then match them up at the next year with the new votes, and you could enter them, yourself. It seems a bit cumbersome, but I think it's possible.
Okay. There's a question, and Karen, if you need to cut us off, let us know. I have two more questions, though. One is, okay, thanks. What are the steps to combine e-votes and paper votes? And does this happen at the time of the meeting? And Dan, this could be another whole class, but if you could make it quick, please.
Yeah, briefly, if it's an election you're talking about, it must happen at the meeting. The electronic votes have already come in, but you're not allowed to open up the election ballots except at the meeting. So it would have to be done then.
And is that the case with non-secret ballots as well?
No, with non-secret ballots, you can open them up as fast as you get them. You can replace them as fast as the voter wants to replace them.
Okay. Let's see. Does it generate numbers for us to give to our residents to vote with? I'm not quite clear what that means. Maybe you have a sense of what that might mean, Dan? Does it generate numbers for us to give to our residents to vote with?
Are we talking about results? Like who wins, how many votes?
It says to give to our residents to vote with. So I apologize. Look, there's a contact address for us. If you want to send clarification to that question to that address, we'll be happy to answer it for you.
It could be they're talking about that if you have a single voting process, that sometimes they'll send a postcard to the address with a number that's used to log in and to vote. The problem with that is you don't know who voted at that address, and therefore I would question the compliance.
Oh, okay. So if that's the case, and yeah, if that's the case, if that's not the case, send us a further question to clarify. Someone guessed that it might deal with authentication. Are you aware of any e-voting failures? The organization went back to paper only.
No, I am not aware of, not with us, nor with I don't know of any a competitor. I've not seen anybody go backwards ever.
We have heard of an election, and we were not part of it, I'm happy to say, where there was some problem with the combining of the paper and electronic. Dan, as I recall, we know an election monitor who was at that meeting, and there was a problem there, so they couldn't certify. As I recall, the monitor wouldn't certify the election. But
yeah, well, that is true. But they didn't leave electronic voting. I think they just switched to another electronic voting software that was more honorable to the voting process.
Okay, all right. Well, we've certainly taken you to the top of the hour. Thank you, Karen, for giving us another couple of minutes to answer those questions.
Absolutely. And if anybody, if your questions didn't get answered or you need more information, please, their email and their phone number is on the screen. Jot it down and give them send them an email or give them a call. They'd be happy to answer any of your questions. And I want to thank you, Eileen and Dan, for doing the seminar today. It was very informative. And I want to thank everybody who's online for participating. And I hope everybody stays safe and healthy.
Thanks, Karen. Thanks all.
Thanks, Karen.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone who attended. Have a good one.
Bye-bye.
Bye.